Super Mario 64. Quite possibly my favorite Nintendo game, and definitely my favorite Mario game. I've poured so many hours into it during casual playthroughs and later speedrun attempts. The movement is almost perfect. It's simple enough for newer players to pick up with just a little practice, and the game is completely beatable with just a base level understanding of movement options. Yet it has a hidden level of depth that keeps experienced players coming back and trying new things. The levels are expertly designed as sandboxes that prod your imagination and encourage you to push the limits of Mario's capabilities as well as your own. If anybody was skeptical of the potential of 3D gaming, Mario 64 got them to shut up. Its influence on early 3D games cannot be ignored. A similarly influential title was the original Legend of Zelda on the NES. This thing basically invented saving, for console gaming at least. There were some methods of saving before The Legend of Zelda, for example passwords, but those were more workarounds than anything, and saving as we know it today got its start here. But I know you didn't come here to get a gaming history lesson from some dickhead who wasn't even alive when it happened, so I'll wrap it up. The Legend of Zelda marked a turning point in gaming, the beginning of the shift away from the short, simple games found in arcades, to the longer, more complex adventures we often see today. Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda, both games whose innovation would go on to define the gaming market for years after their release. But you might have noticed that I didn't write half a paragraph talking about how much I love The Legend of Zelda, because it's borderline unplayable. It was good for its time, but only for its time. I like games. I like watching them, I like playing them, and I especially like talking about them. Unfortunately, I run into some issues when it comes to judging older titles. Namely, should I be judging classic games by today's standards or the standards of their times? Big shoutouts to my friend Cooper for helping me recognize this issue. As a bit of context for the rest of the video, you should know that I'll only be looking at Nintendo games because that's just what I'm most familiar with. And also that my first console was the Wii, so I consider anything on the N64 and before a classic title. Naturally, what I say here can be applied when comparing, say, Wii games to Switch games, but seeing as I grew up on those, I imagine I'd have a harder time taking an objective look at them. Let's go back to the two examples I brought up in the intro. If I were to make a best games of all time list, I would put Super Mario 64 above The Legend of Zelda without hesitation. However, if I were to create a greatest games of all time list, I would run into a bit of a problem. You see, it's debatable if Super Mario 64 is even the best platformer on the N64, much less the best game, period, because the N64 has an absolutely killer library. The NES, on the other hand, has like 3 good games on the entire system, so even a somewhat okay game like The Legend of Zelda should be considered a titan of the library. Considering the general quality of NES titles, The Legend of Zelda was an absolute triumph of game design, and for that it might be a greater game than Super Mario 64. But I'm still not looking to play it again anytime soon. And I know there's someone out there wondering why the hell I've spent so long talking about a Mario game on the N64 and a Zelda game on the NES. And to them I say, is this your video, moron? And also you have a good point. Those were just 2 games I have strong opinions on, and the titles that I think best represent the 2 extremes of games that were good for their time. Though both were massively innovative and helped define not only their consoles but their respective eras in gaming history, Super Mario 64 is a masterpiece that still feels fresh, while The Legend of Zelda feels incredibly dated. But I recognize that talking about those 2 could be a tad bit confusing, so let's focus by taking a look at only one game that I have strong opinions on. Mother has got to be one of the best RPGs on the NES. Its aesthetic was entirely different from anything else on the console. It was about a gang of kids with psychic powers fighting robots and aliens. It was crazy, and I have immense respect for the entire team behind Mother for even just coming up with some of these ideas that were so unlike anything else at the time. That being said, Mother is a horrible, terrible game that absolutely nobody should play, not even fans of the series. Regardless of how good it was for the time, it's aggressively unfun, and I can't stand it. Kind of. See, while I never plan on playing it ever again, playing it twice was 2 times too many, I can't help but respect it. Mother is the embodiment of this issue for me, and it's a game I've had strong and conflicting feelings about ever since I first played it, especially considering that its sequels carry all of its strongest aspects while improving on its gameplay. Should I have given Mother more of a pass when I reviewed it because it had much less of a foundation than its sequels, or was I justified in criticizing it like a more modern game? I apologize if this video has been somewhat disorganized and confusing, but that's because this is a topic I greatly struggle to wrap my head around. But through looking at the differences in my opinions on all these games, I've come to my conclusion on this issue. Older games should be judged by modern standards. It's important to acknowledge the limitations these games faced, and in fact, you should praise these games for being able to work within and around their limitations. In case I haven't been clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with liking older games. But they shouldn't be exempt from criticism just because they were made at a less advanced point in gaming history. Case in point, there are older games that still hold up under modern standards. Whether or not a game is old or new should have little effect on whether or not you should play it. So while it's a good thing to respect older games for working with what they had, they should be judged just as harshly as newer games. At the end of the day, the game will either be worth my time or not. And if it's not on the Nintendo Wii U, it's not worth my time.